Analysis. According to official statistics released by the Armed Forces of Ukraine in late 2025, F-16 pilots had intercepted more than 1,300 airborne targets, cruise missiles, and one-way attack drones since the jets entered service in August 2024. The figure represents a measurable reduction in the destructive capacity Russia can bring to bear on Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure. The aircraft's arrival and the combat record it has accumulated in roughly 15 months of operations constitute one of the most consequential capability shifts of the Ukraine war since it entered its attritional phase. Ukraine's Air Force Command has stated that on December 13, 2024, during a mass Russian aerial assault involving nearly 200 drones and 94 missiles, a single Ukrainian F-16 pilot destroyed 6 Russian cruise missiles in one combat sortie. The Air Force Command confirmed that 2 of those kills were achieved using the aircraft's M61 Vulcan rotary cannon, a weapon firing 20mm rounds at 100 rounds per second, against cruise missiles traveling at over 650 kilometers per hour. The technique had been drilled in simulators with American instructors. The pilot executed it in live combat for the first time that morning. The Air Force Command's official statement on the engagement. For the first time in the history of the Fighting Falcon, an F-16 fighter jet destroyed 6 Russian cruise missiles in one combat mission. The assessment applied across the F-16's full operational history in all air forces globally that have flown the aircraft. The aerial situation before the F-16. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine's fighter fleet consisted primarily of MiG-29s, aircraft designed in the 1970s and 1980s for a threat environment that no longer exists. Russian military sources reported over 90 Ukrainian aircraft destroyed in the early days of the invasion. Ukrainian figures were more conservative, but Kyiv acknowledged by mid-conflict that fewer than 60 operational fighter jets remained. Ukraine had effectively lost air superiority from the opening days and would not recover it through numerical competition. Ukraine's adaptation was ground-based. Surface-to-air missile systems, a patchwork of Soviet-era infrastructure supplemented progressively by Western Patriot and Hawk systems, turned Ukrainian airspace into an attrition environment for Russian aviation. Ukraine's Air Force Command has cited the destruction of nearly 700 Russian aircraft and helicopters across the conflict's duration. Russia adapted in turn. Its aircraft began launching guided glide bombs from positions well beyond the effective range of Ukrainian ground-based air defenses. In March 2024 alone, Russia launched approximately 3,000 of these weapons in a single month. The Royal United Services Institute documented the cumulative infrastructure impact. Russian strikes had destroyed 9 gigawatts of Ukraine's domestic power generation capacity by mid-2024. Ukraine's total peak winter demand is 18 gigawatts. Half the country's generation capacity had been eliminated. Ukraine needed aircraft that could push Russian bombers back. The MiG-29 was structurally unable to do so. Its radar systems cannot detect Russia's modern long-range air-to-air missiles, particularly the R-37M, whose engagement range can destroy a MiG-29 before the pilot has received a targeting alert. Ukrainian pilots were forced into terrain-masking flight profiles at treetop level to avoid Russian radar coverage. A colonel in the Ukrainian Air Force described the operational reality. His pilots flew on a knife's edge. The MiG-29 also cannot effectively intercept cruise missiles. Its targeting systems were not designed for that engagement profile, and its electronic warfare capabilities were decades behind Russia's Su-35s. The F-16's specific advantages. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is not the fastest fourth-generation fighter in service, and Russia's Su-35 can match or exceed it in raw speed and turn radius. What the F-16 provides is avionics integration, radar capability, and electronic warfare performance that changes the terms of engagement rather than matching Russia aircraft to aircraft in pure performance. The AN/APG-68 radar system detects targets at ranges that leave Russia's older jets scrambling for position. The electronic warfare suite jams, deceives, and disrupts enemy targeting systems. Critically, the aircraft is fully compatible with the entire ecosystem of NATO standard munitions. Every missile in the Western Alliance's inventory, every smart bomb, every targeting system. The compatibility issue that had constrained Ukrainian use of British Storm Shadow and French Scalp EG cruise missiles, which required custom-built integration frames for Ukraine's Soviet-era Su-24 aircraft, and for some weapons could not be feasibly integrated at all, is resolved. Ukraine now flies aircraft designed for the munitions the West is supplying. The air-to-air weapons suite includes AIM-9 Sidewinders for close-range engagements and AIM-120 AMRAAM medium-range radar-guided missiles for beyond-visual range combat. The United States confirmed preparation of 500 AMRAAM missiles for delivery to Ukraine over a 16-month window. A Ukrainian F-16 pilot who spoke to the war zone described the shift in operational terms. Against Russia's jets, the fight would no longer be one-sided. It would be an equal fight. For a pilot who had been flying on a knife's edge in a MiG-29 for 2 years, parity is the operational objective, not superiority. Delivery timeline and fleet composition. The first F-16s landed at a secured Ukrainian airfield on August 4, 2024, Ukraine's Air Force Day, a date chosen deliberately. The Netherlands and Denmark led the delivery effort. Norway and Belgium followed. According to reporting by the War Zone, approximately 85 F-16s have been committed to Ukraine in total. 24 from the Netherlands, 19 from Denmark, 12 from Norway, and 30 from Belgium, with Belgian deliveries scheduled through 2028. Ukraine's pilots trained in the United States and at a dedicated hub in Romania. Ground crews were retrained. Command and control procedures were rebuilt from the foundation. The 18-month gap between European pledges in 2023 and actual delivery in 2024 reflected the institutional scale of the transition. The F-16's cockpit, avionics architecture, maintenance protocols, and communication systems are entirely unlike anything Ukrainian pilots had previously operated. Building operational proficiency from scratch, without established in-country infrastructure and without U.S. contractor support in the field, required a level of institutional adaptation that the Air and Space Forces magazine characterized, citing a visit by a Ukrainian F-16 vice commander to the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies in Washington as developing entirely new tactics tailored to one of the most hostile air environments in the world. The tactical doctrine Ukrainian pilots developed is a version of what the U.S. Air Force calls agile combat employment: dispersed operations, frequent relocation between airfields, minimal infrastructure, maximum unpredictability. Ukraine did not copy the doctrine. It ran ahead of it in live combat under fire. The combat record. The 1,300-plus intercept figure from official Ukrainian Air Force statistics covers cruise missiles and Shahed-type drones. The War Zone, citing Ukrainian Air Force pilot accounts, placed total aerial kills across the F-16 fleet at over 1,000 Shahed-type drones and cruise missiles by early 2026. On at least one occasion, a single pilot reportedly destroyed 6 cruise missiles and 7 attack drones in a single sortie, using cannon fire after all available missiles had been expended. On the ground attack side, Ukrainian Air Force figures confirmed more than 300 successful strikes against Russian ground targets by late 2025. These missions destroyed vehicles, command centers, ammunition depots, drone operator positions, and logistics infrastructure across the Eastern Theater. The aircraft was performing both roles simultaneously, defending Ukrainian cities from above and striking Russian military assets on the ground. Army General Christopher Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, confirmed to U.S. lawmakers that Ukrainian F-16s were flying every day and had defeated a large number of cruise missile threats and delivered a significant number of offensive attacks in the Eastern Theater. The losses. The program has sustained documented losses: 4 aircraft and 3 pilots as of official figures released in late 2025. The most publicly significant was the August 2024 death of pilot Alexei Mess, known by his call sign Moonfish, killed days after the fleet entered service. Ukraine's Air Force Command West confirmed that Mess had shot down 3 Russian cruise missiles and 1 attack drone in the moments before his aircraft went down. Post-incident reporting raised the possibility that the aircraft was struck by Ukrainian air defenses in a fratricidal engagement, a plausible outcome in the operational environment of a mass Russian assault involving hundreds of simultaneous targets across multiple vectors. Zelensky dismissed the commander of the Air Force in the aftermath. The incident illustrated the institutional stress of operating a fundamentally different aircraft type, with different electronic signatures, different communication protocols, and different identification parameters, in an environment where Ukrainian ground-based air defense operators were simultaneously tracking hundreds of incoming Russian projectiles. The glide bomb problem and its partial solution. Russia's Su-34 bombers had been launching guided glide bombs from positions deep inside Russian territory, well beyond the reach of Ukraine's surface-to-air missile coverage. The bombs were destroying Ukrainian frontline fortifications and enabling Russian infantry advances. The scale, 3,000 in a single month in March 2024, produced destruction that ground-based defenses could not effectively address. F-16s equipped with AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles provide Ukraine with a tool to suppress enemy air defense radars. The suppression of enemy air defenses mission that is one of the most technically demanding profiles in modern air warfare. By forcing Russian bombers to accept greater risk or move further back, Ukraine can reduce the glide bomb threat without having to intercept every individual weapon. The Dutch Air Force has confirmed that Ukraine is authorized to use its F-16s for strikes inside Russian territory, an authorization that enables operations against Russian bomber bases, logistics infrastructure, and air defense systems positioned across the border. NATO integration and industrial logic. The F-16's strategic significance extends beyond its immediate combat record. Before Ukraine flew Western aircraft, there was a fundamental incompatibility at the heart of its relationship with NATO's military supply chain. Soviet-era jets required custom modification frameworks to carry Western munitions, and for some weapons, the integration was not feasible regardless of modification effort. That barrier is eliminated. NATO has decades of stockpiled munitions designed specifically for the F-16. The production lines supplying those munitions are running. The supply chains are established for a long-duration conflict. Russia's attrition strategy depends on outlasting Ukraine in the consumption of military resources. The F-16's integration with NATO's industrial base is one of the most structurally significant counters to that bet, not because of any single aircraft's performance, but because it converts Ukraine's air arm from a Soviet-era system requiring custom Western support into a NATO standard system supported by the alliance's full industrial weight. France has announced plans to deliver Mirage 2000 fighter jets to Ukraine, with a training program covering more than 4,500 Ukrainian personnel, a scale indicating more than a transitional contribution. Ukraine's defense minister has urged Britain and Germany to consider Eurofighter Typhoon deliveries. Swedish Saab Gripens have entered the conversation. What began as a transfer of aging European F-16s is evolving into the foundation of an entirely new Ukrainian Air Force, built on Western standards and supplied by Western industrial capacity. As the Warzone and Air and Space Forces magazine have reported, NATO is effectively using Ukraine as a live combat testing environment for Western air systems, accumulating operational data on F-16 performance, munitions effectiveness, and tactics under conditions no exercise can replicate. The alliance is refining doctrine. Ukraine is building institutional capability. Russia is absorbing the cost. The suppression of enemy air defenses mission in practice. The AGM-88 HARM, high-speed anti-radiation missile, is designed to home on the radar emissions of enemy air defense systems and destroy them. Ukraine has been employing the weapon on its aircraft since 2022, initially adapted for Soviet-era jets in a configuration that required improvised integration. The F-16 carries the HARM natively, with the targeting, employment, and egress sequencing designed into the aircraft's avionics architecture rather than bolted on as a workaround. The operational theory is sequential. F-16s suppress Russian radar systems, creating windows in the air defense network through which other aircraft or munitions can operate. As those windows are created, Russian Su-34 bombers carrying glide bombs face a choice: continue operating with greater exposure or move their launch points further back from the front. Both outcomes favor Ukraine. In the first case, Russian aircraft face greater risk from Ukrainian fighters and air defenses in the newly opened corridors. In the second case, the effective range of glide bombs against frontline fortifications is reduced because the additional standoff distance reduces precision and increases flight time. Neither outcome eliminates the glide bomb threat entirely. Russia's Su-34 fleet and its glide bomb inventory are large enough to absorb losses and continue operations. But the cost per target calculation for Russia's air campaign changes when aircraft face genuine risk rather than operating in effectively uncontested space. Ukrainian Air Force planning is, according to Air and Space Forces magazine, focused on making the entire Russian aerial campaign systematically more expensive in aircraft, pilots, and munitions, driving up the cost of the attrition strategy rather than defeating any single component of it in a decisive engagement. The Kursk operation and the air support dimension. When Ukrainian forces launched their incursion into Russia's Kursk region in August 2024, the operation required air support for Ukrainian ground forces operating inside Russian territory, a mission profile that ground-based Ukrainian air defense systems could not provide. F-16s, authorized by the Dutch and other supplying governments for operations inside Russian territory, could. The Kursk operation, capturing over 500 square kilometers, including dozens of settlements in the opening days, the largest Ukrainian ground operation on Russian soil since World War II, was explicitly framed by Zelensky as one stage toward ending the war on terms favorable to Ukraine, creating Russian-held territory as a potential negotiating asset. The air dimension of that operation, conducted by F-16s over Russian territory against Russian logistics, command posts, and air defense infrastructure, is consistent with the broader use of Western-supplied aircraft in an offensive rather than purely defensive role. The strategic cascade effect of Kursk, drawing Russian forces away from other front sections, disrupting Russian operational planning, and creating the political embarrassment of a Russian president who's declared special military operation was now producing active combat on Russian soil, was enabled in part by Ukrainian air capabilities that had not existed before August 2024. The pilot training pipeline and its Ukraine's pilot training pipeline has been one of the binding constraints on F-16 deployment scale. Training in the United States and at the Romania-based hub has produced pilots qualified to fly the aircraft, but the conversion from Soviet-era jet experience to F-16 proficiency requires more than technical flight training. It requires rebuilding the tactical intuitions, situational awareness frameworks, and decision-making sequences that experienced combat pilots develop over years in a specific aircraft type. Ukrainian pilots who transitioned from MiG-29s to F-16s were simultaneously learning a new aircraft, new weapons systems, new communication protocols, and new electronic warfare management, while the war continued around them. The pilots who had most successfully made the transition, according to Air and Space Forces magazine, were those who treated the F-16 not as an upgrade to their MiG experience, but as an entirely different craft, requiring entirely different mental models. The 6 kills in 1 sortie record on December 13, 2024, was achieved by a pilot who had built enough accumulated F-16 experience to execute a cannon employment technique against moving cruise missiles under combat pressure, a technique he had only practiced in simulation. France's Mirage 2000 training program, covering more than 4,500 Ukrainian personnel, represents an expansion of the training pipeline that Belgium's ongoing deliveries through 2028 will require to absorb. The pipeline's throughput is, over a multi-year horizon, as significant a determinant of Ukraine's air capability as the number of aircraft committed. Aircraft without pilots qualified to employ them in combat are not operational. Building the institutional depth to sustain and grow the fleet is the long-term challenge that the training program announcements are designed to address. The information and signaling dimension. The F-16's presence in Ukrainian service has produced an informational effect that operates independently of its physical combat record. Before the first aircraft landed on August 4, 2024, Russia maintained a public claim that Western fighter jets would never be permitted to fly over Ukrainian territory, that such a step represented an escalation threshold that would produce qualitatively different Russian responses. That claim served a deterrent function. If European governments and their populations believed that F-16 transfers would escalate the conflict, the political cost of the transfer would be higher. The aircraft's arrival, Zelensky's public ceremony with Dutch and Danish officials, and the subsequent weeks of operational flying without the Russian escalatory response that had been predicted followed the same pattern as every previous weapons threshold Ukraine had crossed: HIMARS, Leopard tanks, Patriot missiles. Each one was preceded by Russian warnings about catastrophic consequences. Each one was delivered without those consequences materializing. Each one then became the baseline above which the next threshold was positioned. The cumulative effect of that pattern on the credibility of Russian deterrent warnings is documented in European political behavior since 2022. The threshold for Western military support to Ukraine has consistently risen as each stated Russian red line was crossed without consequence. The F-16 is the most visible instance of that pattern in the aviation domain. It also establishes the precedent for what comes next: the Mirage 2000 deliveries, the Typhoon and Gripen conversations, and whatever aviation capability Ukraine may eventually require that has not yet been identified or committed. The U.S. Air Force's development of AI-integrated F-16 variants, including a demonstration in which the Air Force Secretary flew aboard an AI-controlled aircraft, points toward a longer-term technology trajectory whose endpoint in the Ukrainian theater is speculative, but whose directional momentum is clear. The doctrine being developed in Ukrainian skies is shaping not only the current conflict, but the capabilities the next generation of Western air combat systems will be required to provide. The strategic picture: air power in an attritional war. The F-16's role in Ukraine's air war must be situated within the broader context of an attritional ground conflict in which territorial control is contested in meters per day. Air power in this environment does not produce the decisive operational effects of the kind that characterize the Gulf War campaign against Iraqi armor or NATO's Balkans operations. The Ukrainian front line's density, the integrated air defense networks on both sides, and the scale of ground forces engaged mean that no single weapon system, including the F-16, will produce a strategic turning point in isolation. What the F-16 contributes is the systematic denial of Russian air superiority over Ukrainian territory, an incremental compression of Russia's ability to use its air arm freely against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, and a growing offensive capability that forces Russia to account for Ukrainian air action as a genuine threat to rear area assets. The 1,300-plus intercepts represent electricity that stayed on, heating systems that kept running, water treatment facilities that continued operating, outcomes that are strategically significant even if they do not produce visible battlefield gains. Russia's attrition strategy rests on the assessment that it can absorb costs longer than Ukraine and its Western supporters can sustain the supply of resources to counter them. The F-16 program and the NATO industrial integration it represents is a direct structural challenge to that assessment. It commits NATO's production lines to Ukraine's air defense for as long as the jets fly, ties Western munitions supply chains to Ukraine's operational requirements, and establishes a precedent: the transfer of frontline Western fighter aircraft to a non-NATO state in active conflict with a nuclear-armed adversary that would have been assessed as politically impossible before February 2022. The Kremlin's response. Kremlin spokesman Peskov publicly vowed that Western-supplied F-16s would be shot down and stated that deliveries would not have any significant impact on the development of events on the front. These were substantively identical to statements Russian officials made the previous year about HIMARS, about Leopard tanks, and about Patriot missile systems. Each new Western capability was greeted with the same combination of explicit threats and public dismissal. In each case, the threats were not executed and the dismissal proved inaccurate. The economic arithmetic of the aerial campaign is also shifting in Ukraine's favor. According to Forbes Ukraine, the cost of a single mass Russian missile and drone attack involving over 200 projectiles was estimated at between $1.2 and $1.5 billion. Russia's total military spending in 2023 was approximately $109 billion for the entire year. Every attack that Ukraine's F-16s and integrated air defense systems significantly degrade costs Russia a disproportionate fraction of its available resources relative to the cost of the defense that defeated it.